The basics of seams. Have you ever seen a tailor make garments? In order to make garments, the master tailor measures and cuts out different parts of the garment, which he then joins together. This joining of two pieces of fabric of a garment is called seams. Thus, seams form the basis of clothing construction. Therefore, knowledge about seams is very important, and that is what we are going to cover in this class. Objectives. At the end of this class, you will be able to define a seam, categorize seams, state the standards for stitching seams, explain allowances for seams, describe the factors for the selection of seams, determine the purpose of using a seam. What is a seam? A seam is a line of stitches that joins two or more layers of fabric. This method of joining two or more pieces of fabric by a row of stitches is called seaming. Categorization of seams. Seams are broadly categorized into two: constructional seam, decorative seam. Let's first see what constructional seams are. Constructional seam. A side seam, underarm seam, waistline seam, etc. are constructional seams. If the purpose of a seam is mainly functional, it is called a constructional seam. Those seams that form as part of the basic and constructional activities for the construction of garments are called constructional seams. These seams must be inconspicuous and as flat as possible. Now let's see what decorative seams are. Decorative seams: piped seam, corded seam, flat felt seam, single top stitch seam, and double top stitch seam are decorative seams. These decorative seams also form a part of the construction of the garment, but by adding a piping or cord, they also serve the purpose of giving a design or decoration to the garment. So decorative seams are made conspicuous, unlike constructional seams, which are inconspicuous. Standards for stitching seams. While stitching seams, one needs to follow certain standards. The direction in which seams are stitched in general is from the wider part of the garment to the narrower, because the grain lines will be matched easier in this direction. For example, a side seam of sleeve will be stitched from the armhole to the sleeve bottom. Only in piled fabric, the seams are stitched always with the direction of the pile, irrespective of the garment being wide or narrow at the starting point. Most of the seams are stitched with right sides of the fabric together. Seams should be backstitched at the beginning and at the end for reinforcement. Allowances for seams. Let's get familiar with an important aspect of seams called allowances. The seam is sewn at the so-called seam line or stitching line. This seam line is placed at the distance to the cut edge. This distance is called the seam allowance or inlay. The straight seam allowance can vary from a range of 1/4 inch wide to several inches. At curved seam, the seam allowance should not exceed 1 to 2 inches. But for areas that require extra fabric for fitting, more seam allowance should be planned initially. Factors for selection of seams. The choice of seams depends on certain factors. Let's see what they are. Seams are selected, finished, and positioned according to need of the garment, the type and texture of the fabrics the garment is made of. Seams are usually chosen not only garment-wise, but also on the basis of the fabric that the particular garment is made of. Both go together. Regular wear such as salwar kameez, tunic top, shirt, pants, blouse, frocks, and tops made of thinner material like cotton, synthetic, silks usually have straight seams, French seam, or may even use welt seam, flat fell seam, or top-stitched seam. Straight seams are the simplest and the best for normal weighing fabric and making of the daily wear. Garments and products like jackets, skirts, etc., made of bulkier fabric such as felt or leather would use a butted seam or lapped seam. The abutted seam or lapped seam is used because the cut edges of felt or leather don't unravel by its very nature. So these fabric pieces can be put one on top of the other. The wrong side of one piece would go on top of the right side of the other piece. So both the right sides are visible outside. Whereas in usual seams, both the right sides of the two fabric pieces are put together and sewn on the wrong side, as the fabric would unravel. And garments or products such as pants, bags, etc., made of jeans would use welt seam, flat fell seam, or top stitch seam. Welt seam, flat fell seam, or top stitch seam are used on fabrics like jeans because they flatten the seams and hide the cut edges. The purpose of using a seam. The main purpose of a seam is to join two pieces of fabric. But additionally, seams such as French seam, flat fell seam, or a straight seam that has a binding prevents raveling of raw fabric edges and neatens the inside of the garment. With this we come to the end of this class. Let's recall what we have learned. A seam is a line of stitches that joins two or more layers of fabric. There are two types of seams: constructional seams and decorative seams. There are certain standards to be met when stitching seams, like seams are stitched from the wider part of the garment to the narrower unless it is piled fabric, in which case the seams are always stitched with the direction of the pile. Most of the seams are stitched with right sides of the fabric together, and that seams are backstitched at the beginning and at the end for reinforcement. Seam allowance is the distance between the seam line and the cut edge. Seams are selected, finished, and positioned according to the need of the garment and the type and texture of the fabrics the garment is made of. The main purpose of a seam is to join two pieces of fabric. They also prevent raveling of raw fabric edges and neaten the inside of the garment. In this class, you now learn the basics of seams. Take our next class to find out about the different types of seams that we are covering during this course.